He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him, nothing was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, and was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory. Glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. You know, it's really interesting. I have to admit, I don't like running. I'm not very good at running. I don't have the endurance for running. I'm not built for running. And you know, it's the problem is I have these weak feet. Seems like as I get older, my feet get weaker. I think the interesting thing is, though, you know, it's not just me who complains about my feet. I think as we look throughout the world, one interesting thing about feet is that they don't get well received, respected. Many of us remember the news reports, don't we? The news reports from watching the Middle Easterners when Saddam Hussein's statue came down. And the thing we all noticed about that was they were hitting the statue with shoes which represent the soles of the feet. For people in that area of the world, the foot is the most unclean part of the body. We have to remember what uncleanliness means for the people in that area. And I think they've got a good idea, especially when you deal with ritual uncleanliness. This is something that comes in contact with the worst things. This is something that the lowliest slave in the household has to clean the feet of the guests who show up. This is why it was so scandalous at the Last Supper that Jesus would clean his disciples' feet as he made them ready and prepared to go out and share the good news that was just around the horizon. I think it's really interesting, though, that God chooses to focus on the lowliest of things, of feet of all things, in order to show his glory. Our Old Testament reading today comes from that wonderful passage in Isaiah. Who can read that passage without being moved by the statement, "How beautiful are the feet upon the mountains"? feet, for all of their indignity, are remarkable things still. What's interesting is something that God commands and instructs people to clean and wash and that we would pass by. God has spent infinite care on the human foot of all things, something we all take for granted. It's interesting, the construction of the foot is such that the ball of the foot, the heel of the foot, when it comes down, plants the foot so that when we rock forward, we can spring forward on our toes. The planting, the going, the standing firm, and the moving forward. These are all things built into the very mechanics of feet, things we overlook or things we despise, and yet God uses them. Isaiah, I love how the prophet works, because Isaiah repeats what God tells him to repeat. And yet one also gets the sense that Isaiah is not fully aware of what's going on, what's going to happen. This is why when the Christ child was announced all those years later, the same religious scholars who had the words of the prophets right before them could not see what God was doing. This isn't Isaiah's fault. He was just repeating the message. He didn't understand it all. But Isaiah believed. And we can believe too in reading this. Over the past few weeks this year, we've been trying to dig into the Old Testament. You know, one of the biggest problems with our church today, with the American church, I mean, is the fact that we have seemed to cut off the Old Testament. We forget that the Old Testament is pointing to Christ. That this story in the Old Testament is about God's redemption plan. And so we are going to continue to look at the Old Testament, and we're going to see that the gospel is written there. And there's something unique about people who got the message but didn't fully see Christ, who weren't present to his epiphany, to his appearing. With that in mind, let's get into the text itself. In Isaiah, this lowly appendage, the foot, is remarkable because it carries something far greater than human conquest. Rather, it carries good news. Isaiah's messenger brings forth good tidings. And those watching on the watchtower hear and rejoice at those good tidings. Finally, we hear that God's holy city, Jerusalem, rejoices as the good tidings are pronounced. So the messenger brings the good tidings. They are first seen by the watchers on the watchtower, and finally, the whole city and God's people rejoice. The prophets of Israel often were given the unglamorous task, though, weren't they? We read so many prophets who have to make a run for it from kings and rulers because they talk about imminent conquest. They talk about the foibles and the failings of the people. They even talk about God's displeasure. Many times they would have to break the news to some king that this defeat was imminent. But here Isaiah has a different task. Isaiah himself did have to deliver such messages to the king. And yet this passage here in Isaiah 52 is different. Instead of a runner announcing the defeat, the runner would be welcomed because he was announcing something different. The runner was announcing victory. This runner would have this fourfold euangelion. This word euangelion in Greek is the word we get evangelical from. It is good news. It is the bearer of good news. And this good news is fourfold if we read here just in Isaiah 52:7. He would publish peace. He would bring good news of happiness. He would publish salvation. And he would remind everyone that God still reigns. Do we think about this? Have we turned Christianity into some sort of lip service that we pay to God? Yes, I glorify you, I praise you, of course, I do all those things, but I know that my salvation is still up to me. It's on me to make sure that I'm okay. But here this messenger coming from the outside, this unknown speaker, tells us that the victory's already won. The battle's already over. God still reigns. And these tidings are not just for a select group of people. Not people who were lucky enough to be born to this person or that family. These tidings are not just for this one city. A city that is doing okay for itself. Kind of an icing on the cake. A pat on the back. Instead, it is a city that needs to hear this comforting message. Because it is a city falling apart. It's a city that has been in ruin. It is a city that has heard all too often the sad messengers of defeat and failing. And so we can expect these watchmen are not expecting to hear good news. For the watchmen, wait not for joyful tidings, but for the next dreadful piece of information to come flashing across their screens. One can imagine how they feel, though, when the approaching footsteps come. The sense of dread, the tension. When all of a sudden, out of the mouth, they hear good news. Tidings of victory. The end of all battles. I remember reading once the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer talking about a recent mine cave-in that happened. Bonhoeffer said that the people who were rescued from the mine, he can't imagine the joy they felt when they heard the slope pick, pick, pick. People chipping away at the things that divided them from where they suffered to the outside world. What joy must have been in their hearts. How they must have cheered for joy. How they must have called out, "We're here. Come and save us." How the watchmen on the tower must have said the same things. How they must have called out for the messenger to come, to bring good tidings right in the midst of their city. Is it any wonder that the watchmen cast off their fears? They give themselves over to joy, rejoicing with abandon. The sound of the footfall that they assumed would bring disaster has instead become the sound of joy. A sound that they will remember for the rest of their lives until the end of days and beyond. And they will tell their children and their grandchildren of the time when hope came to their town and the message of joy. But like all people who receive truly wonderful good news, they do not sit on the message, do they? They do not allow joy to pass them by. Instead, they themselves become proclaimers, throwing wide the city gates, and allowing all of Jerusalem to join in this rejoicing, to sing praises because the victory has been won. This victory that Jerusalem sings of here at the very end of our first lesson, our Old Testament lesson. Listen to what is said. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of the Lord. The people in Jerusalem would have known this all too well. What a wonderful passage this is, because it combines the two qualities that people believed in their heart, knew to be true about their God. They knew that this was a God who mixes the displays of power in an arm that brought the people out of Egypt, as in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 8, and Jeremiah 32:21. But this was also a God who promised to dwell among them, as the last chapter of Exodus reminds us. And so the people now have this comforting message. They will not have to rebuild their city on their own, nor will they have to wait until the next disaster creeps over the horizon. Instead, the people can allow God to move into their neighborhood, to dwell among them. What's so interesting about this prediction is to see its fulfillment. The wonderful passage that we read for the gospel in John chapter 1 talks about this. It states in there this curious phrase, he dwelled among us. What does that mean? Well, in the Old Testament, that word means to tabernacle. This would have brought to mind the dwelling of God, first in the tabernacle that people brought with them in their wanderings, and later on in the temple that they built in the center of their city. But now, this temple, not built with human hands, is dwelling amongst them. And yet, in all of this, Isaiah never fully grasps the picture. Which means that later on, during Jesus' birth, the religious leaders never really grasped the picture. Always waiting for a God that will come to them on their own terms. Always waiting for a God that will appear to them the way they think God should appear. But Isaiah didn't fail. What he tells us is what he heard. That there is a messenger coming who will bring this good news of victory and the presence of friendship with the victorious one. This is why the Old Testament proclamation is so important for us Christians today, especially here at Christmas. We see in it the importance of the messenger. The fact that there are those watching and waiting for a message. And the rejoicing of people who hear they are not besieged by a dangerous army, but have been besieged by God's grace. Like that messenger, we know that God has become present. And he has become present for us in the manger, just as he has become victorious for us on the cross. So what of today? Do the watchers watch those who are supposed to bring good news with joy? Does the world look and listen for the footfalls, thinking that they will bring good news? There are many explanations about why this may not be the case, from the failings of the proclaimers to the hard-heartedness of the world. But I'd like to offer a different perspective. There's one easy thing that we can do. We need to look at our feet. Too often we expect that our feet must be beautiful if they'll carry a beautiful message. Too often we expect that our feet must work properly, as they did in our youth, or as the person sitting or standing next to us does. Too often we think of our own feet and how imperfect they are, how God cannot use the imperfect feet. When that happens, let us listen to Isaiah. The beauty of the feet is not their own intrinsic beauty. Maybe the runner was stumbling. Maybe the runner wasn't the fastest. The beauty of the feet is the message that the runner carried. Instead of worrying if we bring the message perfectly, instead of looking to our own faults and failings, let us remember the gospel. Let us remember that in the manger, the feet of the shepherds were not the most beautiful, and yet they came. The feet of Mary and Joseph were tired and worn out, and yet they bore the salvation of the world. Let us remember that it is the good news that makes the feet beautiful. Friends, my feet can only carry me so far. But I have heard the footsteps of the one who stepped down from heaven and took on flesh. And that means that my message is the most beautiful of them all. Merry Christmas.